Good morning. Happy Earth Day. If everybody can go ahead and take their seat and get comfortable. We've got a good session this morning. I want to welcome everyone. I just want to say I'm certainly very happy to be here. This is one of my favorite themes. I've been involved in the theme of hope and conservation for a number of years and promoting the idea. And I think that last time I checked, conservationists are people. And we know what motivates people. Social psychologists have been studying it for a long time. And we know it's not negative messaging or gloom and doom, but it's a sense that you can do something. So even when things are difficult, take Churchill in World War II. That's the kind of optimism we're talking about. It's a go to battle, roll up your sleeve optimism. And so I think we're fulfilling that promise here at this summit. And so and I know that since we had a late start, I'll keep my comments brief and just go ahead and welcome everyone and introduce the speakers. So I'm going to let you know who the speakers are going to be, and then there won't be individual introductions for each speaker as we go. So our theme today is working in communities, and my background is working with species conservation, but long ago we learned that we can't do that in isolation, and so in our work we certainly also work in engaging the local communities to support those species conservation programs. So I'm really excited to learn about how our speakers today are addressing these issues in diverse locations around the globe. So what we're going to have here is a series of speakers. We're going to start with Mark Bouman from the Field Museum, and then we're going to have Peter. I've already forgotten your last name because you're a substitute. Can you say your name again? For Peter Fearnhead, who's the CEO of African Parks. We're going to have John Kasaona, who is from the Namibian Integrated Rural Development and Nature Conservancies, and Bob Steneck from the University of Maine. And lastly, but not leastly, Sebastian Troëng from Conservation International. So thank you very much. So our first speaker, Mark, if you can. Oh, okay. Well, sorry. Nobody tells me anything. So.
Gang Saving Rivers. That sounds like an exciting title. Conservation, as you probably know, is a matter of life and death. 3 weeks ago, almost exactly to the hour, shortly after midnight, a flash flood hit without warning in the city of Mocoa, the capital of Putumayo department in the Colombian Amazonia. Over 300 people were killed, and another 100 people or so are still missing. Conservation International's team spent the previous week in Mocoa and left only a couple of hours before the flash flood actually happened. The guy who took them to the airport and his family were amongst the perished. And whilst our staff were fine, over a dozen of our partners are among the dead and the missing. The flash flood and its impact on people were caused by a combination of factors such as poor urban planning, obviously heavy rains, but also extensive deforestation in the Piedmont region, where the Andean mountains drop down towards the Amazon lowlands. And as we work to help our partners in Mocoa put their homes and lives together again, this serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when ecosystems that regulate water are destroyed and their function, their water regulatory function, is diminished. Loss of ecosystems that regulate water flow can result in flash floods when you have very heavy rainfall and you have a steep slope that pulls with it soil and rocks and vegetation, just like what happened in Mocoa. But when there are times of little rain, then the loss of these same ecosystems can result in drought and in water stress. And this is a challenge that's particularly urgent for cities, and no more so than cities in Latin America. Latin America is the most urbanized region in the world. Over 80% of people in Latin America live in urban areas. And one of the most important ways that people in Latin America benefit from nature is through water. Water for drinking, for agriculture, for industrial purposes, for energy production. And in three of the mega cities in the region, Mexico City, Bogota, and Rio de Janeiro, that together have a population of about 45 million people. Just to put that in perspective, that's more than the people that live in California, and almost as many people as live in Spain. In these three cities, we're working with a range of partners, national and local governments, companies, and of course communities, to secure the ecosystems that provide most of the water that these cities consume. Most of the water in places like Mexico City come from the water forest, a small area between Mexico City, Toluca, and Cuernavaca. In Rio de Janeiro, the water comes from the Guandú and Paraíba do Sul watersheds. And in Bogota, it comes from the Bogota conservation corridors, and that contains some of the largest, actually the largest paramos in the world. Paramos are also known as Andean moorlands, and is an ecosystem that's only found in Latin America. Unfortunately, these ecosystems that we so much depend upon are under threat from urban expansion and from agricultural practices. In Mexico City, the Bosque de Agua, the water forest, is being chipped away at about 1% per year. The Atlantic forest in the watersheds around Rio de Janeiro has already been heavily deforested. And in Bogota, the water regulating wetlands within the city have declined with a whopping 99% since the 1940s. Now, if we stick to Bogota and we go higher up in the mountains above the city, we have these paramos that occur over 9,000 feet in altitude. This photo here is from Chingasa National Park that provides a staggering 80% of the water that's consumed by the people of Bogota, the 11 million people in the city. So it's about a fifth of the country's population that depend on this national park for their water consumption. And these ecosystems are absolutely stunning. And you see the plants here, they're known as frailejones. They have little furry leaves that actually capture the moisture out of the clouds and eventually make it available for people to consume. So it's really a natural water factory. If you then add another of the paramos, the Sumapaz paramo, which is the largest in the world, you have another 15% of the water that people in Bogota consume. And historically, the water used to get to the city through one of the 192 streams that was flowing into the city. But as has happened in many cities around the world, most of those streams, of course, have been built over or diverted, and the few that remain are degraded and contaminated. So you might ask yourselves, with environmental degradation causing landslides that kill hundreds of people, including our partners and friends, and many of the cities in the region facing water stress, what on earth could someone be optimistic about when it comes to conservation of ecosystems that provide water in Latin America? So let me tell you about a shining success in an unexpected place, Quebrada Las Delicias. Conservation of this stream began about 10 years ago when some of my colleagues in Conservation International in Colombia decided to set out to demonstrate that you can restore these ecosystems with benefits to people. And so they started conducting a scientific assessment, because science matters. They identified the stream that had the best enabling conditions, both from a social and from an ecological perspective, to allow for a successful recovery. And this was the stream they settled on, Quebrada Las Delicias. It's about a 15-minute walk from the apartment where I live in Bogota. It stretches from some of the high-end neighborhoods close to the city center, up through marginal areas at the edge of the city, into the hills of the eastern side of Bogota, the Cerros Orientales. This is what Quebrada Las Delicias looked like in 2008. More of a garbage dump, really. So obviously the first task was to figure out how to clean up the river together with local communities. So working with the communities, we collectively removed about 150 cubic meters of trash, including a dead body, because the zone or the area around this river was really no man's land. It wasn't a safe place for people to walk or to enjoy nature. After the cleaning of the garbage, most of the vegetation in the area was actually invasive, a plant known as gorse. And so the team then had to work with the communities to remove about 1.5 hectare of invasive gorse. Then they set out to replant with native vegetation, over 8,000 plants and vertical gardens in the lower parts of the stream. They engaged graffiti artists from the local neighborhoods to paint nature-based themes on the remaining concrete areas around the stream. And then, of course, they involved local children in a range of activities to raise awareness and create local ownership of the project. This included a carnival to launch the project and to increase the local appreciation for ecosystems that provide water to people. At one stage in the project, we employed 10 gang members to help in the restoration efforts and to help us to monitor birds and wildlife that have returned to this area as a result of the restoration work. So far, we've recorded the return of 2 species of hummingbirds, a flycatcher, and even the turkey-like Andean guan can now be seen along the stream. Today, you can join local guides and go for a walk about 1.5 miles. You end up at this spot, which is a 140 feet tall waterfall from the center of a city of 11 million people. It really is quite extraordinary. And by involving local authorities, we've managed to get the police to patrol the area from 5:30 in the morning to 10 o'clock, so people can walk and enjoy nature without being worried about their security. And I would say that what more than anything makes me optimistic about this are the local leaders that have emerged through these efforts. And I think that no one is more inspiring than my friend Danilo Ochoa. Danilo grew up on the streets of Bogota. He joined the gang when he was 14. He did drugs. He spent a stint in prison. But he has really turned his life around. And through his engagement in the river restoration and conservation efforts, he's become a respected community leader. He now runs a small art center, art gallery next to the stream, where he teaches conservation, art, painting to local kids to keep them out of trouble. And of course, this has a life-changing effect on the kids who participate, but it also benefits society. The cost of keeping a youth in a detention center in Bogota is about $5.5 grand a year. And the work of Danilo and the other community leaders have resulted in savings because of the reduced demand for youth detention. We've generated some concrete results, both in terms of recovering ecosystems and seeing species returning, but the path has also become the second most popular nature trail in Bogota, and more than 3,000 people a week enjoy nature along the Quebrada Las Delicias. The project has received the Global Best Practice of Ecological Restoration Award because of the effort, and I think we can proudly say that it's a model for restoration that's now being replicated elsewhere. So we've come a long way from the garbage dump. Here's another photo from when the project started in 2008, where cows were denuding the vegetation and contaminating Quebrada Las Delicias. And this is from last Saturday when I walked with my daughter up to the stream. You can see how it's been replaced by lush vegetation and a walking trail that people can enjoy and connect with nature on a daily basis. Today, we're building on these successes and replicating this approach together with the municipality of Bogota, the Regional Environmental Authority, and the Water Authority, as well as civil society and community organization. And we're applying the similar method for streams in Usaquén, Chapinero, Usme, and Sumapaz. And to really scale up our efforts, we were also working with the same partners on a $50 million Green Climate Fund project that aims to conserve the entire Bogota conservation corridor that produces the total of 95% of the water that's consumed by Bogota. I think that both Colombia's fragile peace accord and avoidance of disasters like the one we saw in Mocoa depend on efforts such as the one in Quebrada Las Delicias, where communities are coming together to restore and conserve ecosystems and to deliver the peace, the security, and the prosperity that Colombia's people desire and deserve. So peace with nature and peace for people, that's a pretty good reason for Earth optimism. And I want to end by remembering our partners in the Biocuencas project and those from Corpo Amazonia who were lost or who lost family and homes in the Mecoa flash flood. And of course, by thanking the dedicated leaders who have inspired us, who have made the work in Quebrar las Delicias possible, and who have created a conservation success in one of the most unlikely of places. So Patricia Bejarano and Fabio Arjona from Conservation International in Colombia, and community leaders like Sofia Lopez and Danilo Ochoa. And of course, the many community members of the barrios Los Olivos, Bosque Calderón Tejada, Juan 23, and Nueva Granada, who have spent countless hours picking up trash and planting native vegetation along Quebrar las Delicias. Thank you very much.
Just wanted to make a very brief announcement. So as we all know, we were supposed to gather at 10:45 and then 11:15, and then we started at 11:16, and then 11:20 I found out the start time was been delayed to 11:30. So we got a jump start on things, and I don't know, this is replicating my travel out here because I had 2 delays and 1 reroute and 1 cancellation, and it took me 36 hours to get here from California. But I am hoping the rest of the session will go better than my trip here. Thanks a lot.
Wow. Well, it's really just great to be here. Actually, at my age, it's great to be anywhere. But I'm going to talk about something really different than what we just heard, and this is battling the coral reef crisis in the little island of Bonaire. As many of you probably know, coral reefs are really, they may be the most endangered ecosystem on Earth. And that's really not news. But the question is, what can we do about it? And what I'd like to really touch on are a couple things. A little bit about Caribbean and their coral reefs, Bonaire and what's up with their coral reefs. And really listening and talking and applying science for management and resilience in Bonaire's reefs. And I think that's where the optimism comes from. So I really want to just start out with sort of the way things were. This is me in St. Croix in 1972, and things were really different then. But what was amazing is coral was everywhere. And while I was working on my dissertation, I watched a living coral reef literally die within a decade and flatten. It was amazing. Caribbean reef decline was widespread. Coral disease of sea urchins, global warming, ocean acidification. You've heard these stories, so is it time to write the obituary? Well, in fact, an obituary was written by Roger Bradbury, and he wrote, "World's coral reefs have become zombie ecosystems, neither dead nor truly alive in any functional sense, and on a trajectory to collapse within a human generation." He wasn't invited to this meeting. But the question is really, are all coral reefs dying? Are they on a trajectory of collapse? And that's really what I'd like to get into. I mean, really, zombie ecosystems? Come on. So in Jamaica, this is some photographs I took in 1978, and it was a coral-dominated system. This is what a coral reef should look like. Within 10 years, this is what it looked like. As a matter of fact, that's the same coral. And the coral had actually shifted to become a seaweed reef. And I went back 28 years later, and it's still a seaweed reef. It is locked into that state. And that's not good. So Jeremy Jackson gathered a bunch of people together. We looked at coral reefs throughout the Caribbean. He gathered 35,000 reef studies over the last 30 years. And let me summarize this for you. We went, if you look at coral abundance and if you look at algal abundance, seaweed abundance, okay? We went from high coral cover and low seaweed abundance in the 1970s to a situation where we had low coral cover and a lot of seaweed. And what has not happened, is not known in the Caribbean, is any reef going in the other direction, actually improving. So in a nutshell, what we're looking at are coral reefs that become seaweed reefs. And this is a photograph I took in Antigua relatively recently, the Bahamas. There is at least one exception, and that's in Bonaire. And this is what introduces us to this particular topic. You know, what's going on in Bonaire? It's a little island off the coast of Venezuela. It's pretty tiny, 20 miles long. And I've been working there really for a good part of 20 years, working towards solutions, monitoring the health of the coral reefs and using science to steer management. That's where the causes of optimism are. So what's different about Bonaire? It has very little seaweed. And you ask the question, why? And one of the things that'll strike you is that there's a lot of parrotfish. And when you look at parrotfish broadly, these guys are the herbivores. These are the deer, the rabbits of this marine system, and they eat the seaweed. So if you go to a place like Jamaica, which is the Geneva standard of a degraded reef, you find very few parrotfish and a lot of seaweed. Bonaire is just the opposite. And this is a very interesting problem because this is where the community becomes important. I was talking to a lot of the fishermen in the area, and the fishermen had stories and photographs they wanted to share with me about the way Bonaire used to be. And they showed me these pictures of this huge fish that they had speared. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't just fish. They were spearing everything. And they're so proud of you know, what they were able to shoot and their spear guns that they included them in the photographs. Within a decade, really the big fish started to disappear. And in fact, it was the fishing community who agreed in 1971 to stop spearfishing in Bonaire. And that's really amazing. I don't know of any other examples of that. The reason why this really matters is that parrotfish are big, easy targets for spearfishing. And so they would succumb to that. So as soon as they stopped spearfishing in the 1970s, you actually had a pretty good population of these herbivores that could keep the reefs clean. So we have this system where you've got a lot of herbivorous fish and in Bonaire, and they keep the seaweed low. But most of the Caribbean has got a ton of seaweed. So what's wrong with seaweed carpets? Well, they stress corals. They reduce the feeding of the corals. They poison the corals. They actually have chemicals that poison the corals. They smother them. They reduce the reproductive output. They make the corals more disease-prone. And it makes the reefs hostile to baby corals. So they are, in fact, baby killers. So they make the reef less resilient. And these are the things that are really critical if you're going to have any kind of a disturbance or a stress. How do you maintain resilience? In a nutshell, seaweed are bad hombres. And so thinking about this, I published a paper with a colleague of mine about the ecological feedback loops. And I know you won't be able to read this, but let me just talk you through it. It's basically thinking about what really matters that make this ecosystem work. The grazing pressure from parrotfish actually keeps the seaweed low in abundance. And because of that, the baby corals can thrive. And as the baby corals grow up, they gobble up space, and that kind of concentrates the herbivores and makes that a little bit stronger. As the coral grows up, it makes a complex reef. The complex reef is actually a good nursery habitat for parrotfish and other fish, and they recruit. And you've got a system that actually, with these kind of positive feedbacks, can maintain itself, and it can withstand disturbances and be resilient. When you take out the things like the grazers, you actually create this entire negative feedback, and you end up with these reefs, as I showed you, that are collapsed, algal-dominated systems that get locked into this alternative, unhealthy state. Okay, so can we put ideas, that bit of science about how coral reef ecosystems work, into management for the coral reefs? And for that, I think it's the bigger picture here was working with and learning from the stakeholders, the fishermen and the people who live in Bonaire, working with the managers, many of them are actually part of the community, building a scientific information base that includes their ideas as well as the science that we can bring to this, and create a durable network that will help management. So I started making these reports every other year with my students. This is 2003, and we said, gee, the coral cover is high, seaweed abundance is low. herbivory is high, but and there's low nutrients. That's all good. But there's relatively few herbivores. And so they asked me to speak to their government, which I did, went to public meetings, made presentations, and we talked to the fishing community about what we can do about the fact that there are really fewer fish out there. And they were very animated about, what was good and what they would go along with. The park ranger actually is from the community. All the rangers are. So the connection between the fishing community, as are fishermen on the left, is a really good one. But what we were hearing is uniformly that the fish are gone. So what are we going to do about that? The big fish were gone. And so the fishing community agreed to create these closed areas, these marine reserves adjacent to the hotels. And it went through, actually, the vote with the fishing community was the easiest thing to get through. It took a lot longer to get it through the Netherlands government. But in any case, it finally did come to pass. And fish protection areas exist. We conducted a number of scientific projects. We had stuff in the newspapers. And so we're trying to apply management science to improve management, because these are very complex ecosystems. But if you study them and you can figure out where the pressure points are, what are the few factors that drive the resilience of these ecosystems, then you can kind of work surgically. So we should be monitoring and managing for those key drivers. And okay, so how do you do that? In 2005, the Marine Park asked me to develop a monitoring protocol. And what I suggested was keep it simple, keep it focused on known drivers and indicators of reef health, monitor trends in the drivers of reef health, and this is what we came up with. This is really not rocket science here. Positive trends and negative trends, okay? It's a coral reef, okay? If corals are increasing in abundance, that's good. If they're decreasing in abundance, that's bad. And so seaweed's the same sort of story. You want less seaweed. You want herbivores. You want big parrotfish. You want to have a lot of baby corals. And because the baby corals are going to add to the coral cover. Keep it simple. Keep it straightforward. We had really 4 drivers that we're watching here. So we conducted this kind of surveys at 11 different sites. And in 2007, our report showed a troubling trend. And really, the no-take reserves were then established the following year in 2008, but we continued our monitoring. So what we end up seeing is the coral cover from 1999, which is actually the very first study, to 2009 was pretty solid and steady. That's good. But the seaweed was actually increasing, and it wasn't high by Caribbean standards, but that's a concern. Parrotfish abundance, they started to drop a little bit, and what was going on was trapping was starting to pick up. Now, parrotfish, they swim with their little pectoral fins, and they sleep at night, and they like to sleep in caves. It happens that fish traps are too much like caves. They go into these traps, and they sometimes die in these traps. So baby corals were also declining in abundance. And so our report in 2009 was, we're really seeing a lot of negative factors here. And so we said, this is a problem, and we suggested that they ban fish traps and they ban parrot fishing. They did that in 2010. They phased out fish traps, banned parrot fishing, and then something very unexpected happened. There was a massive bleaching event, and it was a stress test for this system. They suffer bleaching, they throw out their zooxanthellae, and the coral actually showed a significant decline. The seaweed showed a spike upward, and the parrotfish abundance was actually not changing. And so we were seeing this as a really unfortunate situation of negative trends. 2011, we said that we saw that the bleaching had killed the corals, but seaweed was increasing, and it made me think, for all the work we've done, in the words of Groucho Marx, the operation was a success, but the patient died. We still had this durable network, and in 2013, we started seeing evidence. Our report said causes for optimism. We saw in 2015, the subtitle said slow but steady signs of resilience. And now, just a month ago, we came up with the following with 2017 data. So the bleaching event happened in 2010. There's a 2011, 13, 15, and we're back up to where we were in 2017 for coral. Seaweed abundance has continued to go down. The parrotfish abundance is now spiking upward. and the baby corals are also spiking upward. We are actually seeing every one of these things that we're managing for go positive. This, we think, is the first documented case of resilience of a Caribbean coral reef. So I think we could conclude by saying that not all coral reefs are dying. Bonaire's reefs are not on a trajectory of collapse. We can just say no to zombies. And really, I think at the end of the day, this is the first resilient reef in the Caribbean. That's optimistic. It suffered a massive bleaching event, recovered fully. It shows that local management working with local communities can protect these beleaguered ecosystems. It also shows it takes a village and more than a decade to create durable marine conservation. With that, I thank you all.
Next one is
back to cities, where the other half world lives. I'm reporting on behalf of a number of community members in Chicago who happen to live near Lake Michigan. And it was on Lake Michigan, this great blue inland sea, when on July 27th, 1919, a young African-American boy named Eugene Williams, swimming in the water just a little bit offshore, went a little too far into a whites-only area. And somebody threw a stone at him, and he struggled for a while, and then he drowned. And he became one of 38 people who died in the race riot of 1919 in Chicago, triggered by an event at a Chicago beach. Not far from that Chicago beach and that Bronzeville community that Eugene Williams was from is the neighborhood of Chinatown, which in the 19-teens was also coming into shape through legal mechanisms and violence-based mechanisms to hold communities in place and away from resources like Lake Michigan. Just west of Chinatown is another neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen, which in the 1950s and beyond, in the 60s and 70s, became one of the main Latino ports of entry into the city, predominantly working class neighborhood with the lowest green space per capita of any of Chicago's 77 community areas. So it's something of a wall that has existed between communities very close that neighbor Lake Michigan and Lake Michigan itself. And so what I'm going to describe here is a process by which folks in those communities have worked to build bridges to the lake, and are also somewhat suspicious of master narratives of biodiversity and of open space, and how they would like to see their own narratives entered into the story. Speaking from the vantage point of the Field Museum, I know about master narratives. And Chicago, the Field Museum grew out of the 1893 World's Fair that was designed by Daniel Burnham, who went on in 1909 to design the great plan for the Chicago region. Burnham intended that the lake should be a resource for all people in the city. And as the city went about doing this, and they put the Field Museum right there on the lake. This is a 1929 aerial view. They made land on the south lakefront, and that's the Bronzeville neighborhood to the right there, that was separated from the lake by railroad tracks and by Lakeshore Drive and by, as it turned out, to be a very desultory maintenance regime by the Chicago Park District, a pattern of neglect on the south side that went into the 1980s and 90s when a court order finally made them pay attention. Meanwhile, the Field Museum itself has a position on the lakefront. There's a glass-fronted convention hall there, McCormick Place, that kills birds every day for the past 35 years. Museum staff have collected the birds from the base of that convention hall and have persuaded the Park District that it's to their advantage to add native landscaping and to think about biodiversity on the South Lakefront, remove the turf grass and remove the weed trees that have grown and diversify the landscape. Park District took that to heart and established, and this is the idea of a Burnham, and Daniel Burnham's name again, wildlife corridor that would run from the museum at about 12th Street for about 3.5 miles down to Hyde Park. And there you see the communities outlined, Pilsen, Chinatown, and Bronzeville. So how would a wall become a bridge? And the Park District began to vigorously move through its process of tearing up the turf grass and planting natives and so forth, but they were not resonating with that message at all in the communities nearby. Communities that for years had regarded much of what the Park District did with suspicion. So they came to us. We had some connections through projects that we had run in these neighborhoods, thinking of a climate change adaptation project that we did and had built up a number of community linkages. And the first step was to think about the bridge as one foundation for the bridge should be to think about the next generation. So we established a group few years ago called Green Ambassadors. Every summer, 12 high school kids would be involved in learning the ecosystems of this gradually diversifying, ecologically diversifying lakefront, but also carry that message back to the communities and connect it back into their work in the neighborhood. They learned techniques of participant action research, did some citizen science, and also became docents on projects like this one, which is another kind of a foundation to involve people themselves in, and this reminds me a lot of the Bogota example, of literally being part of the restoration activity, not just removing invasives, but in this case, on Mother's Day in 2014, 30 different community organizations were connected to bring 900 people to plant 25,000 trees. It happened to be Mother's Day weekend. It was a great intergenerational activity. It was fantastic to see kids get their fingernails dirty, and my museum president get his fingernails dirty as well. It also was important to see Green Ambassadors take leadership in this moment, these teens, guiding groups of people out to the planting sites, helping them with that. And then later, in reflecting on the experience, saying every time they drove down Lakeshore Drive, they would say, well, we planted that. That's part of the landscape that we had a hand in helping to become. In 2015, this turned into a butterfly meadow planting across 2.5 acres, a lot of milkweed and other native plants. And there's kind of two foundations of a bridge. But there needs to be something like a span. That master narrative is still in place. This is biodiversity. It's good for you. You should like it. This was not necessarily a resonant message in communities along the South Chicago lakefront. And so working again with community organizations, we developed what we called a co-curation committee to put into place 5 different public art installations in the 2.5 miles along the South Lakefront. The co-curation committee consisted of members from local community organizations, local artists. They devised a request for proposals. They reviewed the proposals and they oversaw the installations. The Park District of Chicago was persuaded to divert $100,000 that had planned for benches. They were going to be the recycled plastic benches that they use, to be $20,000 each for each of these 5 projects. So I'd like to walk you through these a little bit. These are some of the co-curation committee. In each of these projects, the project design required integrate some element of nature, integrate some element of community cultural heritage, and have a community artist partnering with a community organization to devise the space. So from the north, caracol, a snail form. This is Diana Solis and Jose Terrazas, who made this snail-like form for an organization called Contratiempo, which does literacy-based work. The place is filled with words on that path written by members of the community on their reflections on the natural space. Philosopher's Stone, Scholar's Stone, a spirit stone, the Chinese-American community organization following a pattern frequently seen in contemplative spaces in Chinese gardens. This one is La Ronda Parataka. This was created by Casa Michoacan and was a comment on the monarch butterfly. Edgar Duarte and Piloto Nieves were the artists. They fabricated monarch-shaped forms and surrounded the space with milkweed on a spot just a couple hundred yards from where Eugene Williams drowned. Sounding Bronzeville was made of willow and was meant to be an auditory experience as the wind whistled through the willow forms and a connection to the sounds of Bronzeville. This is the Bronzeville Community Development Partnership that created this space, and we're thinking here about Louis Armstrong, everybody from Louis Armstrong to Chance the Rapper, folks from the neighborhood. Sankofa for the Earth uses the Sankofa bird. Go back and fetch it is the West African proverb, meaning go back for your heritage to move forward in the space. This space was a mosaic. It also had images of people from the neighborhood, Emmett Till, Gwendolyn Brooks, people who, as you were in the space, a few steps from the Illinois Central Railroad tracks that were such a major migration path for African Americans to the north, was part of the experience, would be part of the experience of the space. So these places were connected to each other by a wood chip path. I'm thinking about the comment from yesterday about 45 minutes in nature and the role that it can play in a community. The Park District itself has finally built an actual bridge and established a plaque in the location that commemorates this as part of a Great Migration Trail along the South Lakefront. All of this in the context of a much richer biological space as well. The 100 acres was going to be expanded to 125 acres. So at the end of the day, what do we have? A richer space biologically, a richer space culturally where people are participating in the creation of the narrative about it. Large institutions working with small institutions, communities working across traditional lines. And I would say the Park District has found this as very useful as a pilot that they intend to deploy in other natural areas across the city now. And folks are feeling that they've found a bit of resilience in a rough part of the world where they've broken down a few of the walls that divide them from each other and from nature and have stayed the hands of the that we're going to throw the stones that sink us. So thanks very much. John.
Right, thank you very much. Let me take you across the Atlantic Ocean over to Africa. I would like to share with you our greatest conservation success stories that is ever told. For the last five years or so, much of the talks in African conservations has been focusing on poaching crisis that we're facing African elephants and rhinos. In Namibia, we also had the same crisis. But this has actually forced us to approach conservation from different angles. We tried to approach conservation by trying to involve communities for them to be involved in the whole agenda of conservation. Because we knew communities that are living with wildlife, they have more solution than us that are living far away from wildlife. The photo you see in the picture there is of my father. He was one of the top poachers in Namibia. But then he was transformed, he became one of the best community ranger, and that has actually laid the foundation for community engagement. What you see on the side here is skulls of rhinos that were poached. The only thing that we could really use to detect how many rhinos were poached during that time was to collect whatever we come across in the field. By then we knew how many we collected, then we knew how many were actually poached during the periods. After independence, our national government changed policies and laws and granted our communities the right to manage, use, and benefit from wildlife. Today we can proudly say that through this process, it has actually paved way for the creation of communal conservancies. Today we have over 82 conservancies across the entire country. These are all conservancies, which you see here, the green area. And they cover an area over 165 square kilometers. We have a total population of just over 190,000 people that are living in conservancy area. As a result of communities' engagement in conservation, we have seen a drastic increase in wildlife. The lions, as we all know, it's not very easy to live with lions. I mean, it's not, you don't want to have a lion next door with little kids. But lions, as a result of community getting involved, the lions' population have increased to the point that they started moving from Tosha. This is a Tosha National Park. And in the middle here, this is where the communities are living. This is where we have community conservation area. They started moving freely from one park to another, crossing through community conservation area. Basically, we have helped extend the conservation landscape. I always said that we somehow also became a victim of our own success. With increase in lion populations, we also started experiencing the increase in human-wildlife conflict. But if you talk to some of the local people, they will say, lion is like a problem child. Normally you would find a way to deal with that one. So let's find a way to deal with lions as long as we think that we need to coexist with us. Animals like rhinos that were almost at the brink of extinction in 1980. Today, we can proudly say that we have the largest free-roaming black rhino population in the world outside national parks. So what I'm talking about now is what is happening outside protected area. Elephants, also around the same period, we have less than 7,000 elephants across the regions, across the whole country. Today we have over 22,000 elephants in Namibia. So, basically what our community conservation program have done is actually to turn wildlife into economic asset for the communities. Today, our communities, through wildlife, are heavily engaged in tourism-related activities, and they are also looking at many other aspects and many other ways to generate income for their own benefits through conservation. Since the beginning of the programs, from the time when the first conservancies were created, we have seen a steady increase in finances. In 2016 alone, the program generated over 10 million US dollar, and conservancy programs in itself, it is contributing heavily to our net national income. And all this money that are being generated doesn't go to government coffers. It goes to communities, institutions. Based on a cumulative investment of 1.9 billion Namibian dollar, our national programs has also generated a cumulative net national income contribution of 5 billion, which is equivalent to an internal economic rate of return of 16%. To me, this is a completely positive economic return for the program investment. Now that we have all this wonderful thing that we have done in Namibia, I know that Namibia is not known to many countries. It's a very small thing. Now that we have done all these things, we are really now looking forward and to see what can we do next. How can we take what we have done in conservation and apply it in other fields, such as community forest, such as fisheries, that will also add value to the local communities that are living alongside this landscape. We are also of the opinion that even though that we have now created and have seen a great change in conservation in this whole area, it's our moral obligations as supporting institutions and government to continue rendering the necessary support to this institution for them to become robust, meaningful, and relevant, and to continue doing the good work of conserving wildlife. We are also trying to see that community conservation area are going to increase their revenue tremendously for the members that are living alongside wildlife to see the real benefit of having wildlife around them. Finally, I normally say that we can say we were successful in Namibia, but I think there were two things that went very well. One of them was that we have a good policy framework. We had the political will, support. Second thing was that community themselves, they were willing. It wasn't something that was forced onto them that you must have conservancies. They willingly wanted to live with animals. They also wanted to make sure that they benefit from wildlife. And the third was basically the incentive, the income. So these were the driver of the successes that we are facing in Namibia today. I normally used to call it the best conservation package, the 3 P's: policy framework, community willingness, and incentive. So I think whoever want to do that, I think this is the beginning where we should really start from. And I would really like to thank the organizer. Thank you very much.
For those of you that aren't familiar with the Namibian program, it really is one of the most successful conservation initiatives, certainly on the African continent, together with the one in the Northern Rangelands Trust in Kenya. So well done, John. This program says that conservationists are emerging from unexpected sources, including gangs in Brazil, poachers in Namibia. The story of African parks, I'm afraid, isn't nearly as exciting as either of those, but it does start with a very passionate young guy at the age of 13 in rural Zimbabwe who was extremely keen on the bush and on wildlife. And I think today it's something where that organization now has grown into probably one of the biggest conservation movements on the continent, and there's more to come. So for those of you that aren't familiar with African parks, It's an organization which formally, after many years, we established in the year 2000 to take on protected areas. So what John was talking about were community conservancies. These are specifically the national parks and formally gazetted protected areas. And what was happening at the time, and which is still happening today, when you've got overall governance challenges, if you want to put it more strongly, governance failure, it's not possible to expect that national parks are going to thrive in a system where you've got governance failure. So the whole thing about African parks was to step in and to be able to take responsibility for some of these areas. If we're successful, then we'll be able to secure as many as 100 protected areas that are bigger than 100,000 hectares. That isn't a lot, but that is the opportunity that faces us. We as African Parks pioneered the concept of what we call public-private partnerships in protected area management. What we like to say is the PPP concept, though, often stands for patience, politeness, and perseverance, because that's what it takes to do conservation in Africa. And what we do as an organization is take on the long-term commitment. So we have agreements with governments, with communities, anywhere between 25 years and 100 years. So we're in for the long haul. Conservation is not a 3 or 5 year program, it's a 100-year commitment. So this is where we're working in Africa. The green dots are the areas where the protected areas where we have mandates for. So we've got 10 national parks under management. The blue ones are areas which we are in the process of bringing under management, and that covers about 6 million hectares. So that's not 6 million hectares that we influence, it's 6 million hectares that we have direct responsibility for. So what happens in these areas is essentially, if it works, then we can pat ourselves on the back. If something goes wrong, it's our fault. These are some of the landscapes, just a couple of pretty pictures that show the diversity of the different types of habitats and regions that we're working in. And of course, with the different habitats come all the different species. Ones that you'll be very familiar with in terms of what we call the big and hairies, the megafauna, but that just represents the bigger picture. Obviously, the smaller stuff is equally important as well. The challenge is considerable. For those of you that heard Gary Nell speaking earlier today, talking about another 1 billion people in Africa in the next 30 years. And unfortunately, when you've got 1 billion people, 1 billion more people, this photograph was taken a year ago. So even today, we have the most incredible impact on the natural resources of Africa. That's a little national park in Malawi, only 70,000 hectares. If that park wasn't there, in my view, it would take probably 2 years before the park on the left looked like the area on the right, and hence the importance to make sure that we conserve some of these very, very last areas. The challenges are many. Complete overfishing of rivers, of lakes for protein, wire snaring. That represents about half the wire snares taken out in less than 1 year. 2 warehouses full of over 30,000 snares. Each one has the potential to entrap an animal for the bushmeat market. Again, protein is an important requirement for everyone. Slides pictures that you are all familiar with. I won't linger on it too long. This was taken a while ago. I can tell you now we had another 9 elephant that were poached in Garamba National Park 10 days ago. And in the ensuing process, lost 2 of our rangers as well. So it's something where it's heavy going. It's very, very real work. That's the context. So in terms of our response to that, it's a very busy slide. I don't expect you to be able to read any of it. But if you want to look after a single protected area, you've got to do all of those things. And if you're not doing all of those things, I hate to say it, it's not quite the 3-legged stool, it's the 5-legged stool, but one leg that doesn't work, that entire thing is going to fall over. So the pillars of what we do, law enforcement, are extremely important. It's the foundation to a properly functioning society. And remember, what's good for wildlife is what's good for people. So people need, in order to thrive, a good system where they can have stability, safety, and security. It's not just for the wildlife. In terms of biodiversity conservation, reintroductions, monitoring, all of those aspects, the community development, making sure that people are benefiting from wildlife. If they're not going to benefit from it, as John was saying, they are probably not going to be conservationists. Enhancing the economic impact of these areas, making sure that conservation areas are competitive as a form of land use and contribute to the overall society. And then extremely importantly and often overmissed, the infrastructure and the management that's necessary to make these areas work. These areas are failing because of bad governance often at a macro level, so you've got to bring in good governance at a micro level in order to show that the overall impact is long-term protected area sustainability. So then just quickly, just a couple of pictures of what the law enforcement's about. So we have 850 rangers that are fully trained, fully equipped, well armed, extremely well trained. It's important to emphasize that to enforce the law, they must first uphold the law. So bringing discipline, safety, and security to these very, very large areas, as I say, is as good for people as it is for wildlife. I think this last year we had over 600 convictions, 600 arrests, 30,000 snares removed, over 100,000 rounds of ammunition taken out of the system, and all of that is, as I say, is good for people. In terms of wildlife management, we do everything that's necessary in the parks, from collarings. Last year, I think we had over 160 different collarings that then we are able to follow up and to be able to monitor. In terms of what's happening to those different species, and I think that was over 9 different species where that was involved. Reintroductions, if we take over a park that has lost species, it's important to be able to bring them back again. Again, last year we moved over 260 elephant to restock a park that had lost all its elephant, and this photograph is taken from that. It looks like an elephant whisperer. That elephant is darted and it is about to go down, so it doesn't look like he's going to lead it all the way to a different park. Over 1,300 head of other species of major game. You're talking buffalo, sable antelope, zebra, giraffe, that are all being reintroduced into a park to bring it back again and to be able to make it successful. Community development, absolutely essential. If you want people to support your conservation efforts, the best way to do that is to make sure that they benefit from it as well. Through enterprise, through education initiatives. Last year we built 9 different schools. We had over 3,000 children in the schools built by African Parks. We supported over 260 teachers, and all of those people are linked to the conservation efforts, and they appreciate it. In terms of tourism, again, it's not just setting these areas aside. It's important that we add economic value to them, and one of the best ways of doing that is through tourism, completely compatible with conservation, as long as it's done carefully. And again, that generates more jobs, more enterprise around these conservation areas. And then, of course, the management and infrastructure, building of roads, getting supply routes in place, even down to things like making sure that you've got boards that are properly functioning for each of these areas, that they're having their board meetings, that they're getting unqualified audits, because ultimately the governance of these parks is just as important as it might be moving 260 elephant. This summit is about optimism. I'm going to use one quick story, because I know we're running out of time, about a very specific park in Chad. I'm not sure that many of you would even be able to point out to where Chad is in the map of Africa. Massive country with terrible environmental pressures. You've got the Sahara moving southwards. You've got a lot of pressure coming out of North Sudan, out of Darfur, out of South Sudan as well. And natural resources are something that that people rely on to survive. The situation in Chad, 6 or 7 years ago, there were 4,500, well, it was a bit more, sorry, about 10 years ago, there were 4,500 elephant in Zakuma National Park in Chad. By the time the president of Chad asked us to come and get involved, that was down to 420 left. So losing approximately 800 elephant a year to some pretty militarized people coming out of Darfur. What did we do as African Parks to turn that situation around? To an extent, it is fighting fire with fire. So We made sure that the ranger force was extremely well trained, properly equipped, with the right, with the right weaponry, we put them on horses so that they had an advantage in terms of their patrolling, and started patrolling the area extremely well. Not without its real challenges, I might add. In our first year of operation, we had 6 of our guards executed by the Janjaweed. They were in the morning prayers. They were mowed down, and they were literally then finished off one by one. And this is the price that people pay. Might have mentioned that just this last week we buried 2 of our rangers in Garamba National Park. It's an incredibly tough place to be on the front line, and these are the stakes, but these are the people that commit their lives to this extremely worthy purpose. We put in quite a sophisticated control center, making use of technology, radio systems, collars on the animal, to make sure that all the elephants are basically protected 100% of the time. We engaged, very importantly, with the local communities. This is a picture of a school, typical in eastern Chad. So by building the schools, by bringing the children into the schooling, making sure that they're understanding what you're about. We put a radio station in every single one of these schools. So the moment that you have people coming out of northern Sudan that are on their way to the park, I promise you these people are not taking out the American Express card and paying for accommodation and meals on the way. These people are raping, they're pillaging, and they're plundering. And when they get to Zukuma, they poach. So it's something where the communities around Zukuma have an incredible incentive to make sure that the moment that they see these people on their way, to call in the scouts, and to be able to come and respond to that situation. And if you treat, we are there for the conservation, we are there for the elephants, but if you make sure that you use those resources for the same reason that you are looking after elephant for protecting people, those very people become the protectors of those elephants. You're completely aligned. As a result of that, there's 420 elephant that I mentioned. Because of the pressures they were under, they did not have any babies under the age of 5 years. And it's something where I'm happy to report now that we have now just counted 81 babies over 3 years old. And that means that that population of 420 has now broken through the 500 level mark. It's something where our next target now will be 1,000 level mark. And I think that is, so for the first time in over a decade, the elephants are on the rise. You can see the many of the babies in the picture there. And I think that is something to celebrate and something to be optimistic about. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. That was an excellent lineup of speakers, and I just want to say, it really served the purpose of the summit well, all of your talks. I think each of you started with a situation that appeared bleak, maybe hopeless, and in some cases there were suggestions that we should give up. And what you all did was, and it didn't happen overnight, but you harnessed human creativity and energy, and you turned things around. And I think these are a template, a roadmap for what we can do, in other locations, so we can turn the tide back in the other direction. And now, I think, is there someone from the conference organizers here? I'm trying to determine if we have our hour and 15 minutes, that means we have time for Q&A. But I don't know because the schedule's been changed. Does anyone here know what the altered schedule is and whether we have time for some Q&A with the speakers? Then I guess I'm the moderator, so I get to make the call. So let's take a few minutes and have the speakers come up. We'll set up some chairs here, and I'll stay here. And if you raise your hand, I'll take questions and direct them to the speakers. Yeah.
Question.
Yes. There's a mic here. Is that turned on?
Yeah. So with the conservation efforts in Africa, have you guys considered probably dyeing the tusk and like the horns and such, like with the dye packs used by banks to prevent poachers? Well, either one of you can answer that one.
What we are doing in Namibia to discourage poachers from actually taking our valuable species, we have been dehorning rhinos so far to date. And that seems to have gone very well. But you know that poachers are also smart. And what they are doing, we have seen once, they will come across a track of a rhinos, and if they realize this is a dehorned rhino, they will get rid of it for them not to waste their effort anymore. So I think we are trying all this effort, but sometimes it doesn't really work very well. But I think from what we have done in Namibia, we have seen a decline in poaching activity from these animals. Yeah.
And
Can I just add to that very quickly?
Absolutely.
So yes, in terms of, there are all kinds of trials about all these sorts of technologies. To be honest, they haven't been terribly successful, because anything that you can infuse, you can also dilute out of. Rhino horn, a little bit more successful than ivory, but with extreme limitations still at the moment. But lots of ideas in trying.
And apparently I'm not in charge. I just got a note. It says, please wrap up by 12:30. So we'll take one more question.
Sorry that I'm so eager. Hi, everybody. Actually, a question to the gentleman from Namibia. I think that some pieces were missing from the presentation. For example, the how. So the Conservancy program is heavily reliant on trophy hunting, and that wasn't really covered in the presentation, nor the images of the slain animals. So, you know, a family that's seeing an elephant or a lion one day on a tour, that same lion or elephant may be killed the next day by trophy hunters. So on the one hand, it's okay for, you know, a rich guy to kill that an elephant, but then it's wrong for a poacher to take that same life. So of course there are some controversial questions here. Namibia has a very low level of corruption, low human population, which also account for some of the conservation successes. And in fact, a few years ago, a black rhino was auctioned for $350,000 in Texas to a rich hunter.
Can you ask the question, please?
Yes,
then?
I'm almost done. And yet poaching has been on the rise in Namibia from 4 rhinos in 2013 to 90 in 2015. So are we looking forward to a disappearing market for trophy hunters? Is there import restrictions into the U.S.? Are we asking these communities to rely on a disappearing market as trophy hunting is increasingly seen as a controversial practice? Is there a move to do what Botswana is doing, for example, in prohibiting trophy hunting?
Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it wasn't deliberately excluded from the presentations. What we are doing in terms of hunting, we call it management hunting. Very selective, based on a scientific report from the experts. Basically, we take old animals, and if you really look at the percentage of animals that are being hunted as trophy, it's very minimal compared to what is actually still in the wild. Yes, it's very controversial, but I think in Namibia, as I said, in Namibia, to get to where we are today, is because of sustainable utilizations. And we encourage hunting. I know it's very controversial. People doesn't want to see it happening. But for the sake of the very animals that are there, it's worth sacrificing one to save the many other that are there. Yes, hunting was on the rise for the last 2 or 3 years because we were a little bit too sleepy, we were too complacent. Looking at where we are coming from, we caught where we are asleep. Because hunting as it is now coming, it's not coming from within the community, it's from outside. People are coming in and bribing community to do certain things. So, and I think as we speak now, we managed really to bring it down because, again, communities are on the alert. they are everybody's involved. If they see a stranger in the area, they report it immediately to the police or the officials that are in the area.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And just one last round of applause, and then we can